Coleman Hughes is one of the most influential young intellectuals in America, a writer, opinion columnist, of course, a podcaster with his very popular podcast Conversations with Coleman. He's been named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the media category. If that isn't enough of a list of accomplishments for you, he's also a musician and a writer. Coleman, we're very glad to have you on Unholy today.
Glad to be on with you. Thanks so much for having me.
We have so many things to talk about relating to the United States, to Israel, to a lot of other things. I hope it's okay if I, start with something that has been on our minds for a very long time here on this podcast, and that is the issue of anti-Semitism in the United States and its spike and its rise in the recent years, coming from the left and coming from the right. How do you look at it, being such an important ally of this community? What do you think when you look at it? What happens?
Yeah, so I think there's two separate things that happen at the same time. One is familiar and old, and it's from the right, and it's essentially the same emotional and psychological source from which Nazism came. That's however, we don't actually have to spend that much time on that because people, Jews are familiar with it and people in general are familiar with it and the psychological causes of it, where it comes from. And so I've spent more time thinking about and focusing on anti-Semitism from the left because it's people have a tougher time actually understanding where it comes from, why it exists, and I the result may be the same as anti-Semitism on the right, namely that people end up focusing all day long on Israel as if it's the only country in the world, when much bigger conflicts just in the past 10 years in the same region have gone virtually unnoticed by those people. But the source of it is not the same as anti-Semitism on the right. The source of it is this philosophy that you can call intersectionality or critical race theory or wokeness, which a whole generation of people on the left have adopted, which says essentially that the way you have to understand the world, similar to how a Marxist must understand the world through a class analysis. There's the bourgeoisie, and they're the working people. Intersectionality says the way you have to understand the entire world is through the lens of race, gender, and sexuality. Meaning, when you look at a problem in the world, you look at a political situation, the first and last question you ask is, who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? And the way you answer that question is racially. So who are the white people? Who are the brown people, right? Now, that may sound overly simplistic because it is, but I promise you, most of these kids on college campuses that are protesting for the first time in their life a war overseas, this is actually how they think about the world. This is the one moral toolkit they have actually been given in life that resonates with them. Now, that's a big problem, but just accept that that's true for the sake of argument, because that gets you 90% of the way towards every anti-Semitic thing that they participate in afterwards. Because for them, and these are mostly American kids, for them, Jews are white people, right? So obviously there's 10 different ways you can actually question that claim, historically and genetically and all the rest, but that's not important for now. What's important is understanding their mindset. For them, Jews are white people and Palestinians are people of color. And that is all you need to know. That's all they need to know to understand who they're for and who they're against. And that's how they come to the issue. Now, I'm not saying there isn't there is within that group, I think, some Islamic anti-Semitism too, because if you're a second generation Muslim student and your religion is important to you and you can sort of drink in anti-Semitism with certain versions of Islam as well. But I think for the majority of these students, it really is that simple.
It's a very useful framing that you've given us there, because in a way it answers a question I know we've been getting from a lot of our listeners. Why is there not an equivalent storm about Iran? And in a way the answer would be because on the framing you've just given us, because intersectionality would say, well, that's people of color killing other people of color, and therefore it's all a bit too confusing. And so people just sort of back away from it and don't say anything. I'd be interested to hear what you say on that. But I did also want to get you to give us the companion piece of what you've just given us, which is an account of anti-Semitism on the left, and ask you about what's going on the right, because there does seem to be an interesting shift in attitudes towards Israel. We've talked about that on the podcast. Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that kind of thing.
Nick Fuentes, which you had an episode about. Yeah.
And then I was going to say, and then obviously not just on Israel, but also on Jews, a shift in attitude. And you have somebody like a Holocaust denying anti-Semite like Nick Fuentes, who he's been sort of mainstreamed, as it were. So I'm giving you a lot there to react to, but interested to know how you sort of pick your way through all of that.
Yeah, I've been watching what's happening on the right with alarm over the past 6 months to a year, and asking the same question as you know, what is going on here? One thing to remind people is that though America has been much better on the anti-Semitism question historically than Europe has, there has always been an element on the right in America that is anti-Semitic. And, you know, there's a great book by Walter Russell Mead called The Ark of the Covenant, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. If not, it's a fantastic read, and it goes into some of the deep sources why American Protestant culture in particular tended to be friendlier towards the Jews than Europe did. But notwithstanding, there's always been anti-Semitism on the right. William F. Buckley made a point of marginalizing the anti-Semites on the right when he was the standard bearer of the American conservative movement. But that just goes to show that there was an anti-Semitic right there to block, and he blocked it. There was Pat Buchanan in the 90s, was very influential, and in many ways the modern anti-Semites on the right are part of his legacy and his tradition. And so the real question is not why is there an element on the right that's anti-Semitic. That's a standard throughout Europe and has been a standard in America. The question is, why is it bubbling up now? And the answer, you know, I'm not 100% clear on what the answer is, but one of my ideas is that for most of my life and long before it, American media has had guardrails, meaning, you know, so like if you look at someone like me, my career, okay, I went to an Ivy League school, I had a philosophy degree, not really in journalism and so forth, but that's not the only reason I really was able to break through is because I grew up in the internet age where I could email or submit an essay to a startup magazine in Australia called Quillette, which was not really mainstream media. It was new alternative media. And because Twitter existed, a magazine that is not The Atlantic or not the New York Times Magazine or not the New Yorker or not the Spectator can actually win a broad reach just on the power of its content alone. So Quillette got big. I submitted to Quillette, and that led to a chain of events where I'm a known public intellectual and a writer today. So that kind of scenario for most of the past 100 years couldn't happen because there were only a few channels through which you could rise in the world of journalism. It was guarded by elites. That fact was resented by many people. There were only a few channels literally on television, and then there were only a few avenues that you could drive down in order to get into this world. And so the people who controlled those avenues, they could make judgment calls on what was simply too crazy to include. So like for instance, on Fox News in the 90s and 2000s, you didn't actually see Alex Jones type characters. Now, Alex Jones, had he been led on Fox News in the 2000s, I think he would have done very well, right? Because there's a market for his brand of conspiracy theory mixed with humor, mixed with charisma, or whatever it is. But the people in charge of Fox News never would have let that on. And that's part of the guardrails that existed in that era. Those guardrails have been fully taken off right now. So you can just, anyone in the world can get a YouTube account, start broadcasting every single day, and try the market on for size. How much does the market like my thing, right? And that's what Candace Owens is. And I think what we're learning is that when you get rid of guardrails on the right, what's left is that people do gravitate in great numbers towards conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism, which is the mother of all conspiracy theories.
What it means actually is that as media opens up, you have to take the good, the Coleman Hughes, with the bad, Alex Jones. Because there's no way of taking only the good.
That's a good way of putting it.
I do wonder, because you know, and I'll send our listeners, if anyone hasn't heard the podcast that you did in August of 2025. It was called Israel, Hamas, and the Myth of Moral Equivalence. And I think for many, at least from my Israeli perspective, I can say for many, it kind of really crystallized where the argument is and why there is no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. You were very, vocal on large stages. You were on the Joe Rogan experience that kind of got to millions. I wonder, as the war ended, do you see it differently, or is it the same for you as you look at it?
I see, what the end of the war emphasized is just how wrong the other side of this argument was. So, throughout the war, I've been on the side of never losing sight of the fact that Israelis in general want to build a society where people flourish, where people have rights, a democracy, a society much like, with some important tweaks, much like the ones that we enjoy in the West. Whereas what Hamas wants to build is an Islamic theocracy of the kind that if you or I were born there, we would probably be doing everything we could to get to the West, to get to the societies more like Israel and more like America. And losing sight of that ethically, losing sight of the question of what world does each side want to build, is to me to lose the forest for the trees. So if you want to spend all your time thinking about, one specific tragic event where there's collateral damage, civilians are killed, and maximize your focus on that to the exclusion of all else, okay, well, you can do that. But you could play that game in any war. You could play that game in the Civil War, where the South suffered much more than the North did. You could play that game in World War II, where the Germans suffered much, much more than the American population did. You could play that game with Japan as well. And I think it's important for journalism to always expose what goes on during war, but that shouldn't actually negate or let you lose the forest for the trees. And that's always been my feeling about it. There's been another side, obviously. It's been very influential, not only on the left but the right, which has said essentially that Israel is committing genocide. So what the end of the war emphasized for me is it proved them wrong for the umpteenth time, right? Because if you're committing a genocide, it would not matter one bit whether or not the hostages came home and whether or not Hamas agreed to disarm. Because again, the definition of genocide is that your goal is to destroy a people. Genocide has nothing to do with the number of people killed and everything to do with the intent behind killing. If you're trying to destroy a people, if that's your goal, that's the goal of the violence, then getting the other side to promise to give the hostages back and disarm, it wouldn't matter at all. That has nothing to do with your goals. You would just continue, if anything, when a genocide is occurring and the other side disarms, it helps the genocide go faster, right? When that's the goal. But what actually happened is at the moment Trump was able to secure a deal in which Hamas sort of agreed to disarm, or sort of didn't, but definitely agreed to give back the hostages, well, the war ended. What does that tell you? It tells you that, in fact, the goal of this war was the 1-2 punch of getting the hostages home and disarming Hamas so it could never again do an October 7th. That was the goal. And when those goals were met, even partially in the second, or at least let's allegedly in the second case, the war ended. So my feeling is just it proved all of the critics wrong. And there were even some people who said, well, we don't know if Israel will stop the war if they give the hostages back. And like, we don't know that. That's what they said, because they actually believed the whole genocidal aim and rhetoric. And so they were proven wrong. Most of them will never admit it, of course.
Can I just go back to the first part of your answer, which was the notion that Israel is building a society like the West, like the United States, that's a democracy, a society that will flourish, and so on. And I'm just thinking of the way your fellow public intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates presented Israel in his book, where he said, actually, by his lights, Israel wasn't comparable to the America of today. It was comparable to the America of the sort of 1950s, Jim Crow. And he was particularly talking about the West Bank, where Palestinians don't have the vote, where you can't say there's a democracy. Who is winning the argument, if you like, in terms of how intellectuals, even progressive opinion, let's keep it with public intellectuals in America, are they seeing Israel the way you see it and the way you've described it, or are they seeing it the way Ta-Nehisi Coates said, which is it's like the America of the past, particularly, not if you're looking at Israel proper, but if you're looking at the occupation in the West Bank?
So this is another reason why the Israel issue has such purchase on the left in America, is because the American left is deeply influenced by its success in the American civil rights movement. In some ways, the American civil rights movement in the 1960s, which was a great success, I'm a big fan of, and wrote a whole book arguing that we need to restore the actual ideology which caused that, and not the latter-day radicalism that claims its mantle. In many ways, that's sort of like the founding important collective memory of the American political left. And what that means is Americans on the left are always trying to sort of replicate that. They're trying to see versions of that in the world and do it again in various ways, do things that rhyme and echo with the civil rights movement. Now, there's a problem with that, which is if you encounter a situation that looks superficially like segregation and Jim Crow, but actually isn't, then you're going to analyze the situation in the wrong moral terms, right? And that's what has happened with respect to people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and the way they look at Israel. In America, segregation was driven by white supremacist ideology, and it was driven by the sense that white people, the explicit ideology, which was taught in schools. It was taught in schools all over the country, not just the South and the North. It was taught that white people were superior to blacks, and that the proper order of society had white people on top in every way and black people on the bottom. It was not a situation analogous to Israel for many reasons. So first of all, there was never in America ever a popular or organized black political movement which sought to take control of the entire country. There's nothing even close to that. In other words, From the River to the Sea as a political project for Palestinians means that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab, right? We say Palestine will be free in the West, but as you probably know, in Arabic, the chant is more often from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab. In American history, there has never been a movement among Black Americans that is equivalent. In other words, there's never been from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, America will be Black. There was never that aspiration, ever. In fact, the most radical Black leader of the 1960s who had any kind of popularity at all was Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X, at his very most radical mood, the most he sometimes asked for was a Black state in Georgia. Other Black leaders had flirted with the idea, like Marcus Garvey was quite popular in this first half of the 20th century. His political platform was Black people should move back to Africa. And some Blacks had actually had actually done that in the 19th century, and that's where the country of Liberia comes from. The point, however, is that there was never a desire among African Americans, much less an organized political movement that put us in zero-sum conflict with white Americans for political power. So that, first of all, that's the fundamental disanalogy between Israel and Palestine. If what Palestinians want, what Hamas wants, which is still the most popular faction, sadly, in Palestinian politics, is they will not compromise. They don't want a two-state solution. They don't want a portion of the land and then to live in peace and harmony. They want the whole thing, and they want the Jews out or subjugated at minimum. And so that makes the equation fundamentally different. Secondly, in the entire history of the African American struggle for freedom and for equality, there was never a sense that violence against civilians was a totally legitimate tactic, right? Martin Luther King was by far more popular than Malcolm X, and every third word out of his mouth was, we mean peace. We want peace. We're going to, even to a fault, even when we are attacked, we are not going to attack back. That's how much we do not believe in violence. It's totally disanalogous to, and the results would have been very different. If Martin Luther King had been like Yasser Arafat or like Hamas is today, then obviously the results would have been very different, and the reaction from white Americans would have been very different. And so if you look both in terms of its political goals and its political tactics, namely terror, the African American equality movement looks nothing like the Palestinian movement. And so that's the fundamental disanalogy here. And people seeking to map the American experience onto Israel-Palestine are bound to misfire and actually become useful idiots as a result, as you can see from Hamas's updated charter.
Coleman Hughes, we obviously could carry on talking for many, many hours longer, but thank you so much for speaking to us for Unholy.
Thanks so much for having me.